When I got back from a weekend trip, the first thing I wanted to do was get inside, unpack and relax. I walked up to the front door, slid my key into the lock, and it wouldn't turn. I frowned and pulled it back out. Tried again. Nothing. For a second, I thought maybe I'd grabbed the wrong key. Then I looked closer. The lock on my front door wasn't the one I'd left 2 days earlier. Someone had replaced it. My heart immediately started racing. I checked the back door. Same thing. Brand new lock. That's when my next-door neighbor hurried across the lawn. He looked relieved to see me. "I've been trying to reach you," he said. "The HOA president was here yesterday." I asked him why. His answer made absolutely no sense. They said it was an emergency. An emergency? At my house? Nobody had called me. Nobody had texted me. Nobody had left a voicemail. Yet somehow I was standing outside my own home, locked out by my own HOA. What I didn't know yet was that changing the locks would turn out to be the smallest mistake they'd made. I'd lived in the neighborhood for almost 8 years. It wasn't a bad place. Most of the neighbors were friendly, the streets were quiet, and until recently, the HOA mostly stayed out of everyone's way. That changed when a new HOA president was elected. She promised to be more proactive. According to her, small problems became expensive ones when people waited too long to act. At first, most homeowners welcomed the idea. Nobody wanted neglected homes or abandoned properties bringing down the neighborhood. But over time, proactive started meaning something very different. Instead of sending reminder letters, the HOA began acting first and asking questions later. Landscapers were sent to mow lawns before homeowners had even responded to notices. Contractors appeared without much warning. Several neighbors complained that they were being pressured into repairs they hadn't even agreed to yet. Most of us assumed the board was simply becoming overzealous. None of us imagined it would go any further than that. The weekend everything happened, I left town to visit my brother. It was only supposed to be 2 nights. Before leaving, I locked every door, turned off the water to the outdoor hose, set my alarm system, and texted my next-door neighbor, Mark, asking him to keep an eye on the place. It was something we'd done for each other for years. The weather forecast mentioned heavy thunderstorms on Saturday night, but that wasn't unusual for this time of year. On Sunday afternoon, one of those storms rolled through the neighborhood. Rain came down hard for nearly an hour. Strong winds filled the streets with leaves and small branches. By the next morning, everything had dried up. Or so everyone thought. What I didn't know was that sometime during the storm, water had been pouring off one section of my roof near the front porch. A passing resident saw it from the street and assumed a pipe had burst inside the house. Instead of knocking on a neighbor's door, instead of calling me, instead of contacting emergency services, they reported it directly to the HOA. Within an hour, the HOA president decided the house needed to be secured. She couldn't reach me. She later claimed she tried, but my phone never rang. No voicemail, no text, no email. Instead, she called a locksmith, and by the time I pulled into my driveway on Monday evening, the decision had already been made. Someone else now controlled the locks to my home, and I still had no idea why. I stood on the front porch for nearly 10 minutes before the HOA president finally arrived. She pulled into the driveway carrying a small envelope. Without apologizing, she smiled and held it out. "These are your new keys." I didn't take them. Instead, I asked the only question that mattered. "Why doesn't my house have my locks anymore?" She answered as if the whole thing were perfectly normal. "We believed your home was in danger." I asked what kind of danger. She explained that several residents had reported water coming from the front of the house after the storm. According to her, they feared a burst pipe had flooded the interior. She claimed she tried calling me. She claimed she had no choice. She claimed she was protecting my property. Then I asked something she clearly wasn't expecting. "If you thought my house was flooding, why didn't you call the fire department?" She hesitated, just for a second. Then she said, The HOA wanted to handle the situation internally before involving emergency services. That answer didn't sit right with me, not even a little. I unlocked the front door with the new key and stepped inside. The house looked exactly the way I'd left it. The furniture hadn't moved. The hardwood floors were perfectly dry. The carpet wasn't damp. There wasn't even the faint smell of moisture. Nothing suggested a burst pipe. Nothing suggested flooding. Nothing suggested an emergency. Then I noticed something else, a muddy footprint, right in the middle of my entryway. Then another. They led toward the kitchen. I followed them. Cabinet doors were slightly open. The utility closet had been opened. The door leading to the garage was unlocked. Someone hadn't just changed my locks. They had walked through my home, room by room, checking things. That evening, I called the locksmith, whose name appeared on the receipt left on my kitchen counter. At first, he sounded uncomfortable. Then I told him I wasn't angry with him. I simply wanted to understand what happened. After a long pause, he finally started talking. He explained that the HOA president had called claiming there was an active emergency. She told him the homeowner couldn't be reached. She said water was leaking inside the property. She insisted immediate entry was necessary to prevent major damage. Under those circumstances, he believed he was helping protect someone's home. He even told me something I wasn't expecting. I asked if the fire department had already been there. I froze. What did she say? He sighed. She said there wasn't time. That answer bothered him enough that he'd taken extra photos before replacing the locks. Not because he expected trouble, but because something about the situation felt off. The next morning, I requested copies of every document connected to the incident. The HOA eventually sent me a file. Inside was the original complaint. I expected pages of reports, maybe photographs. Instead, the entire chain of events had started with a single email from one homeowner, just 3 sentences long. I drove past the house during the storm. Water appeared to be coming from near the front door. You may want to check it before serious damage occurs. That was it. No one confirmed it. No plumber was called, no city inspector, no emergency services, no attempt to contact my next-door neighbor who had been watching the property. One email, one assumption, and somehow that had turned into strangers entering my home and changing every lock on the house. That's when I realized something. The biggest problem wasn't that they made a mistake. The biggest problem was how easily they believed they had the authority to make it. For the next 2 days, I couldn't stop thinking about that email. 3 sentences. That was all it took for someone to decide they could enter another person's home. The more I thought about it, the less it made sense. If the HOA genuinely believed my house was flooding, why wasn't there a single photograph of water inside? Why wasn't there an invoice from a plumber? Why hadn't the water company been contacted? Why hadn't the fire department responded? Every answer led to another question, so I started making phone calls. The city's emergency dispatch center confirmed there had been no calls to my address that weekend. The local water utility had no record of anyone reporting a leak. Even my insurance company told me they had never been contacted about possible water damage. It was becoming painfully clear the HOA had declared an emergency without involving a single emergency service. Then something unexpected happened. The locksmith called me back. I found something, he said. He explained that after our conversation, he reviewed the paperwork from that weekend. The work order contained a section describing the reason for the lock replacement. I expected it to say active water leak. Instead, it read, property appears abandoned. HOA requests lock replacement for community protection. I asked him to read it again. He did. Property appears abandoned. Abandoned? I'd been gone for less than 48 hours. My truck was in the driveway until Friday morning. My trash cans had been brought back in. My porch lights were on timers. Nothing about the property suggested abandonment. The more documents I requested, the stranger the story became. The HOA president had told me the locks were changed because of flooding. She had told the locksmith the property appeared abandoned, and according to the original homeowner complaint, someone had simply seen rainwater running off the roof during a storm. 3 different explanations for one decision. That was when my next-door neighbor, Mark, remembered something. "I've got something you should see." He walked into his house and returned with a small USB drive. His home security cameras faced part of my driveway. "I didn't think it mattered at first," he admitted, "but after everything you've told me, I think you'll want to watch this." We plugged it into my computer. The footage started just after noon on Sunday. The HOA president arrived first. A few minutes later, the locksmith pulled into the driveway. They stood outside my front door talking. The video had no audio, but one thing immediately caught my attention. Neither of them looked rushed. Nobody was panicking. Nobody was acting like a house was filling with water. They weren't running hoses. They weren't carrying emergency equipment. They weren't calling anyone. Instead, the HOA president spent several minutes pointing around the front of the property. Then she smiled. The locksmith nodded. And together, they calmly walked up my front steps. There wasn't a single sign of an emergency. Only 2 people behaving as though they had every right to enter someone else's home. Watching that footage changed everything, because it destroyed the one defense the HOA still had. If there had truly been an emergency, you would have seen urgency. Instead, you saw confidence. The confidence of people who believed the rules simply didn't apply to them. And that video would become the piece of evidence the HOA could never explain away. The HOA scheduled a special board meeting the following Thursday, not because they wanted to apologize, because they believed they had done everything correctly. By the time I arrived, the clubhouse parking lot was already full. Word had spread through the neighborhood. People weren't there because of a landscaping dispute. They wanted to know one thing: how an HOA had managed to lock a homeowner out of his own house. The HOA president opened the meeting with a prepared statement. She repeated what she'd been saying all week. The board acted in good faith. The situation appeared to be an emergency. Their only goal was to protect my property. For a moment, it almost sounded convincing. Then I stood up. I wasn't carrying a stack of papers, just a small folder. I asked a simple question. If this was truly an emergency, why are there 3 different explanations? The room went quiet. I held up the original homeowner email. One neighbor thought they saw rainwater running off the roof. Nothing more. Then I held up the locksmith's work order. Property appears abandoned. No mention of flooding. No mention of an emergency. Finally, I read the letter the HOA had sent me after I returned home. It claimed the locks had been changed because of a possible plumbing emergency. 3 documents, 3 different stories, for the same decision. The board members started looking at one another. The HOA president tried to explain. She said the wording wasn't important. The important thing was protecting the property. That's when the locksmith walked into the room. I hadn't invited him to speak. He volunteered. He introduced himself, then calmly explained exactly what he'd been told before replacing the locks. He told the room he'd specifically asked whether emergency services had already responded. The answer had been no. He asked whether a plumber had confirmed a burst pipe. Again, no. Then he looked directly at the board. I agreed to change those locks because I believed someone's home was in immediate danger. He paused. If I'd known there wasn't an actual emergency, I would have walked away. You could hear people whispering across the room. The board members looked stunned. The HOA president looked at the table in front of her. She still hadn't said a word. Then Mark stood up. Without saying anything, he connected a laptop to the projector. The security footage from his house filled the screen. The room watched in complete silence. There was no panic, no rushing, no leaking water, no emergency vehicles. Just the HOA president calmly chatting with the locksmith for several minutes before walking to my front door. Someone in the back of the room finally said what everyone else was thinking. "That doesn't look like an emergency." Another homeowner stood up, then another. Several admitted they'd supported the HOA at first because they believed the story about flooding. Now they realized something much bigger. The HOA hadn't responded to an emergency. It had created one. The board called an immediate recess. 25 minutes later, they returned with their attorney. That alone told everyone the situation had changed. The attorney spoke instead of the HOA president. Every action taken at my property was declared unauthorized. The lock replacement should never have been approved. Every expense I incurred would be reimbursed. The HOA would pay for a completely new lock system. The management procedures would be rewritten immediately, and until an independent review was completed, the HOA president's authority to approve emergency actions was suspended. Nobody applauded, nobody celebrated. The room was too quiet for that, because every homeowner sitting there had reached the same conclusion. If one misunderstanding, one email, and one person's unchecked authority could lock someone out of their own home, it could happen to any of them. And that realization was far more unsettling than anything the HOA president could have said. The board kept its word. Within 2 weeks, every lock on my house had been replaced again. This time, by a locksmith I chose, not one chosen by the HOA. The reimbursement check arrived a few days later. It covered the locksmith, the hotel I'd stayed in that first night, and every expense connected to the lock change. But if I'm honest, none of that was the part I cared about most. What stayed with me was the feeling I had standing on my own front porch that first evening, putting my key into the lock and realizing someone else had decided they could control access to my home. That's something you don't forget. The HOA president resigned before the independent review was finished. Officially, the board announced it was for personal reasons. Around the neighborhood, though, everyone knew exactly why. The management company quietly adopted a new policy. Any situation involving entry onto private property now required emergency services, law enforcement, or the homeowner's direct authorization. No exceptions. Mark and I still laugh about one thing from time to time. He'll point at my front door and ask, "Those your locks?" I always smile. "Yep." Then I'll lock the door, slide the key into my pocket, and appreciate something I'd taken for granted for years. The simple feeling of knowing my home was truly mine. Sometimes people think a story like this is about locks, or keys, or an HOA making a terrible decision. It isn't. It's about boundaries. Because the front door to your home isn't just another piece of property. It's the line between your private life and everyone else's authority. The HOA crossed that line believing they were protecting my house. Instead, they reminded an entire neighborhood why some doors should only ever be opened by the people who live behind them.